Starship Troopers, directed by Paul Verhoeven. So I hadn't seen Starship Troopers in about a decade when I rewatched it last night. I remembered the very, very basics. Marines fight bugs, anti-fascist satire, but that's really about it. In the time since I had watched it, I had begun to equate satire with comedy in my head, or black comedy at least. I don't really know why that began to happen, other than a lot of satire is comedic in nature, but I was in for quite a shock going in expecting a dark military comedy. Instead, what I got was a very dark, so I got that part right, but very dark, but deeply exciting war movie about the follies of fascism and jingoism. Right off the bat, we meet our protagonist, Rico, a not super smart rich kid football player who decides to join the infantry so he can become a citizen of the great human empire. See, there's a big difference between a civilian and a citizen of humanity. A civilian is allowed to live within human territory, but they can't vote for leaders, and they struggle to get the required license needed to have children. Whereas a citizen, which you can become by enlisting in the military or serving the state in some capacity, has the ability to vote, and it's easier, although not guaranteed, to be allowed to have kids. The first part of the movie follows Rico, Carmen, Rico's soon-to-be pilot girlfriend, Carl, Rico's psychic best friend, who ends up being a military strategist, and Dizzy, Rico's friend who spends most of the movie thirsting after him, as they go through their last days of high school, getting a lecture from a professor about the failures of democracy and how bomb-diggity the military is, dissecting a giant bug for science class, and winning the last football game of the year. You know, all that classic high school stuff we all went through. All the characters decide to join the military for their own reasons, and after a loving goodbye between Rico and Carmen, we follow them to their respective training camps, sans Carl, who we won't see again until about the end of the movie. And this is when the movie gets really good, as we see the inner workings of the military and how they operate and train their people. What I mean to say is, it's completely full of cocksure morons so high on the idea of violence and destruction that they can't think 45 seconds into the future. Right off the bat, we have a scene where the training officer, after doing his full metal jacket spiel, challenges any willing recruit to fight him, and when a volunteer does step up, he immediately and deliberately breaks his arm to prove a point. That point that pain is all in your head. Something that is barely true and doesn't really help at all. He doesn't care about that. He wanted to fuck up a fresh-faced kid, and that's what he did. Not long after that, we see the recruits being trained on how to throw knives. When a different recruit correctly points out that throwing knives aren't exactly optimal weapons against an enemy that can shrug off bullets, he too is reprimanded, this time with a knife through the hand. Awesome. The instructor then shouts,
"The enemy cannot push a button if you disable his hand."
This is not to mention that bugs don't have hands, and the bugs don't seem to use buttons at any point in time, and even if they did, to either of those questions, they would still presumably have more than one. No, they're being trained with throwing knives because it's totally badass and makes them feel strong and powerful. Throughout the first half or so of the film, the bugs are often alluded to and even seen in glances, but their presence isn't really ever felt. You constantly get the impression that they're exactly what they seem to be. Oversized bugs, no intelligence, no empathy, no higher functions other than eat, kill, mate, rinse, repeat, ad infinitum. This is until a giant meteor destroys Buenos Aires, where all our main characters are from, lighting a fire up under them all as they prepare for war to exterminate every bug from here to the opposite side of the fucking galaxy.
Let me tell you something. I'm from Buenos Aires, and I say kill them all! Yeah! Oh, yeah!
The problem with this is, how can a bug both be completely mindless and capable of shooting a meteor across the galaxy to a major human city, destroying the whole thing? The answer is, it can't. There are two equally likely possibilities. Either the humans are lying, and they did it to themselves, / allowed it to happen to create an excuse to go to war, and the bugs had nothing to do with the meteor, or the bugs did it in retaliation for the humans colonizing their planets, and they're incredibly smart, because launching a meteor specifically across a galaxy without computers, which we never once see the bugs using, is what I would call an impressive feat. It would essentially make the bugs infinitely smarter than humans. I tend to lead towards the idea that humanity did it to themselves to justify a war they figured they could win against the brainless bugs, but there's evidence for either conclusion. But either way, we're off to war. Fueled by rage, humanity sends legions of infantrymen and ships to the planet of Klendathu, the home planet of the bugs. We're going to kick ass and kill every single one of them, thinks every soldier, before actually landing on the planet and getting utterly annihilated. I actually really liked what the movie does here. For so much of the film, the bugs are depicted as scary but an ultimately manageable threat. No one seems particularly terrified by them, and everyone thinks this is going to be an in-and-out mission. So as an audience, we start to perceive them in that way, a functional non-issue. And then Klendathu happens. The Battle of Klendathu is genuinely horrifying to watch, an utter massacre against the humans. Almost immediately you notice that the soldiers are expending almost entire clips of ammo to take out a single bug, and there's a lot more than a single bug to deal with. The planet is swarming with them. Thousands scurry across the battlefield, tearing the soldiers apart so brutally that the horror movie fan in me was actually impressed. Now, that may not mean a lot to you if you don't know me personally, but I am a horror fanatic and a complete sucker for gore. You know how every time someone starts talking about horror and they say, I don't like when it's just gore, that's not interesting to me, that's not real horror. Yeah, I think all those people are narcs. I love gore, through and through, and watch movies with the specific intent of seeing some. So when I say that the deaths of some of the soldiers are real rap brutal, I mean it. From tearing people in half to impaling them while they're still screaming, this battle scene is a rough watch by any metric, and it makes you, the audience, feel the shell shock that the characters do. You've been prepared for a typical war action sequence, and it's bugs. It's gonna be awesome. But this battle isn't ever awesome unless you're a sick man like me. It's a dark and horrifying look into the actual results of war, the death, the pain, the destruction beyond measurable imagination. Not minutes after boots hit ground, a complete and total retreat is called, and while the media reports 100,000 deaths in under an hour, when we see the military bases numbers, it's closer to 300,000. Humanity is shocked. How could we have lost a fight to brainless bugs? We see a Fox Newsian broadcast where two people viciously argue about whether or not the bugs are capable of thinking. The man in the argument ends up shouting,
Brain bugs? Frankly, I find the idea of a bug that thinks offensive.
This is the thing about fascism. Your enemy always needs to be lesser than you. Unthinking, unfeeling automatons worth no more moral consideration than, well, a bug. However, they also need to be enough of a threat to need swift and brutal destruction, or else your society and way of life will never recover. By dehumanizing the villains to the point of complete moral neutrality, the movie asks us to consider the very nature of propaganda. Fascists demand that we think of the enemy as bugs to squish beneath our feet, and yet when going against them, still manage to lose. The war continues, but everything has been tainted by the fear and utter destruction we saw in Klendathu, and we start viewing the film a bit differently. At first, you're impressed with how quickly Rico rises through the ranks in such a short amount of time, going from recruit to sergeant in what can't be more than several months. Then a realization hits you. He's not getting promoted out of merit because he's so good. He's getting promoted because people keep dying in this losing war, and no one has enough time to actually think everything through. Towards the end of the film, the squad Rico is working for gets a bunch of new soldiers, and they're at the absolute oldest, maybe 16, and probably closer to 14. Humanity is recruiting literal children because of how quickly they're barreling through their own soldiers. And it all just keeps piling up, as you realize that the movie you're watching is functionally an in-universe propaganda film. All the little infomercials split throughout it are clues towards this. You are watching a fascist empire losing a war, badly, desperately trying to spin their failure in any way they can so they can continue to brainwash and recruit the masses. Starship Troopers isn't the black comedy that I went in expecting. Instead, it's a much sharper, more brutal and fantastic satire, and I really, really loved it. Can't recommend it enough. Megalo Box. So I don't really watch any sports. If you put me in front of a TV, I can usually enjoy curling after a little while, and I get weirdly patriotic and invested in the Olympics, but otherwise, I don't really care about them. But for whatever reason, I love fiction about boxing and competitive fighting. I don't know what it is. I don't really have a lot of interest in watching boxing, and I blanketly refuse to watch MMA or whatever because the whole affair makes me uncomfortable. But if you give me a show about it, I am in. I think a part of it is I really like competitive storytelling, like stories about competitions in whatever way. I really like Battle Royale, I like Kaiji a lot. I would argue that Death Note to some degree is like that. I just really love it all. So Megalo Box was already fighting a downhill battle. This is already in my wheelhouse of what I like. But fortunately for me, even though it didn't have to do a lot to gain my approval, it still did, and it was a fantastic show beyond that. Megalo Box is about the titular sport, which is basically just boxing but with cybernetic enhancements. And yes, it is absolutely as awesome as it sounds. And a young man who's great at the sport but has ended up in a position where he's just throwing matches in an underground ring for the mob. There are several scenes where we see him deliberately making mistakes that he's above just to maintain the illusion of a fixed match. His frustration is ever increasing as he watches opportunities where he could have won the fight, shown off his skills as a megaloboxer with one quick blow, and has to let them pass by so he can appear weaker and the fight can go as scheduled. Frustrated one night after taking another dive at an opponent far inferior to him, he tries to pick a fight with the world champion megaloboxer. And while he can't initially, he actually ends up in the ring with the man and gets completely obliterated. He almost lands one punch while the champion is fighting with one arm, and that is the greatest victory of the match. And this lights a fire under him. He's done throwing matches. He's done playing the part of the mob has set up for him. He is going to train, and he is going to rise up the ranks of the official megaloboxing. He up to this point was fighting unregistered, and prove himself. There is one more complication, however. The only opportunity he's going to be able to have for the rematch with the champ is in 3 months. And in those 3 months, he has to make a massive name for himself, which can only really amount to 5 matches. Question is, how is he going to do that? The solution that is settled on is the near suicidal idea that he will megalobox against massive dudes with cybernetic enhancements without any of those enhancements. Almost literally bringing a knife to a gunfight. A cybernetically enhanced boxing match where he doesn't have that. See, through an honest and true defeat, his passion for the sport is completely reignited, and he wants nothing more than to prove himself for real. He can no longer remind himself that he's better than all of his opponents and he would have won if he just wasn't in the situation he was in. He wouldn't have won. He lost, fair and square. More than that, with his opponent spending most of the match with a severe handicap, with that newfound knowledge that he isn't actually the best, but maybe he could be, that drives him to make a change. To treat the sport not as something he knows he's good at, but as something that he needs to be better at. That he needs to prove to the world, the people around him, and to himself, that he can be the best. In the lead up to writing this, I was trying to put my finger on why I love stories like this so much. And I think that's it. I really love that the inciting incident here is his own failure. And what drove him to improve was the irrefutable knowledge that he lost, and the desire to achieve a level so that it doesn't happen again. That's what this whole project is about for me. Me looking at my failures in the eyes. I did not write regularly for 5 years. I squandered some absolutely great YouTube momentum that I could have capitalized on. All the while trying to pretend that my skills weren't atrophying. I had to start again, attempt to rise a position that I can be proud of. Now, me and the protagonist's goals aren't exactly the same. I have no belief that I will ever be the best, but I can live with rising to a level I'll be happy with again. To move on, though, the animation on display is often gorgeous. The fights are so smooth and kinetic that I couldn't help become deeply invested in them, such that I was disappointed when the story brushed past some plot-irrelevant bouts, because it meant I would be seeing less fighting, even if removing them did help expedite the story. And man, the soundtrack. I cannot describe how fantastic the soundtrack is. Alternating between hip-hop and chill-hop that creates both a feeling of effortless coolness and pumps you the absolute hell up. While writing this, I just put it on in the background and almost immediately felt like I was watching the show all over again. Each dramatic beat putting goosebumps on my arms and filling me with a giddy excitement at what was coming next. This part is odd, however. The soundtrack is fantastic, but the opening theme is terrible. The first episode doesn't have one, so having heard the songs up to that point, I was incredibly psyched for whatever hip-hop track they had in the hopper that would encapsulate the entire feel and momentum of the show, only to find out that it's a mediocre butt metal track that shared almost no DNA with the rest of the music and was completely boring. This is a small issue, considering the music used in the actual show is so good, but I did just end up skipping the opening every time, and that was disappointing. I want to call out a specific shot. During one of the last fights, where the main character, driven by anger at a recent betrayal, decides to start using cybernetics again. Realizes he can do this without compromising all the progress he's made. Prove that not only can he win, but he can still do it without the enhancements. And he allows these cybernetics to be destroyed and fall off his body. And the shot is this Michael Bay-inspired one that made me cheer at the screen. I was originally going to show it during this segment so I could explain what I'm talking about, but I'm actually going to show it at the end of this analysis. So if you actually want to watch the show, you won't be spoiled on it. And just hit the time codes in the description and save your first viewing of that shot for when you're actually watching it. I recommend this if you're having any intent of watching Megalo Box, because if that shot does not get your blood pumping, our differences as people are so fundamental, I wouldn't even know if we could speak the same language upon meeting each other. House of X / Powers of X, Volume 1. Written by Jonathan Hickman, drawn by Pepe Larraz and R.B. Sylvia. So last video I vaguely alluded to the fact that I have no respect for superhero comics. And here I am talking about a superhero comic. So let me clear some things up right off. Firstly, and probably most importantly, I do respect the people who create superhero comics. Mostly. As far as I can tell, it's incredibly hard to make them, and it takes an insane amount of talent to do so. It's just too bad that that talent is usually being wasted on corporate IP that demands creativity to be stifled at every corner. I have complicated feelings on the issue. Basically, every person who has worked in North American comics has worked on a superhero comic before. It's a way to break into the industry, it pays, it's reliable, and say what you will, people buy them. Although a lot less than they used to for reasons I could make a 4-hour video about. Far be it from me to begrudge people a steady paycheck, and a lot of people whose writing I really respect have worked in capes. Lemire, Brubaker, Remender, Moore, DeCampi, etc., etc. But ultimately, I've very rarely found anything that I thought was actually above average. It has a lot of the same limitations that the Marvel movies have, another thing I distinctly hate. Ultimately, the powers that be demand that no actual permanent changes be made, so things can continue on as usual. And if permanent changes are actually made, you can trust that in a writer or two they'll be nuked back again, with very rare exception. They deliberately always have to be marketing to a broad audience. But what it comes down to is this. Ultimately, almost all the superhero comics I've ever read have felt distinctly cookie cutter, even when written by people whom I really like otherwise. I often find myself wondering where that spark that I see in other work is. Ed Brubaker is one of my favorite comic writers alive. I maintain that him and Sean Phillips are the best team in comics. And when I read his Batman stuff, I felt nothing. None of the things that made his style, his writing so interesting were present. It was just another middle-of-the-road, inoffensive Batman story. And there are very few things in life I dislike more than mediocrity. But about once a year, I always try to give superhero comics a chance. I'm willing to have my mind changed, or at least be pleasantly surprised. If you talked to me 4 years ago, I would have told you that manga was all garbage, and now I have 2 small bookcases full of it. So I try to give the things that I don't like a chance. This year's contestants for the Please Impress Me contest was House / Powers of X. This is an X-Men comic written by Jonathan Hickman, and I've been a really big fan of his for quite a while now. I love his really weird and unique style. Very few people burst onto the scene with such laser-precise intent and unique energy that his debut comic, The Nightly News, had to offer. A comic both written and drawn by him, that seemed to be more inspired by infographics and advertisements visually than a traditional comic. I also love, and I want to get back to the Black Monday murders, and I had a grand old time with East of West. So I gave it a chance. It is my yearly tradition after all. And I'll be damned if I wasn't pleasantly surprised. Part of the thing that bothers me so much about superhero comics is I always feel like the personality of the creator is sapped. Something that is very clearly not a problem here. House of X is a story about repeating timelines with massive graphs helping to keep track of everything, and long government document style info dumps. Oh Hickman, how the superhero genre needed your influence. No. House/Powers of X is Hickman to the very core. From incredibly long spanning stories, this has scenes that go as far as 1,000 years into the future, to a love of graphs that help aid the storytelling, to the fact that Hickman loved to spend a large part of the beginning of his story just setting the scene, which is pretty much all that's happening in the volume that I read. This, however, does make it hard to actually discuss the meat and potatoes of the story, as clearly Hickman is going somewhere with all of this, and right now he's just setting the stage for me. So, to explain, House and Powers of X are two separate series collected into one volume, since they both are intertwining and telling different parts of the same story. Honestly, this is part of why I don't like superhero comics. I hate having to know that if I'm just to understand where things are going, I need to keep track of several different comics at once, just to maintain a handle on everything. This is why I like more indie comics. Want to start reading Preacher? Do you want to know where to start? Start with volume 1 of Preacher. And then you move on to 2. And then so on and so on. None of this, you need to start with House of X, then after 6 issues switch to Powers of X, then you gotta do this writer's storyline nonsense. Now, fortunately for me, they're all collected in this one volume, so the non-superhero savvy can keep track. I really like the art in both series, although I had a pretty strong preference for Pepe Larraz's art, which I thought paired incredibly well with Hickman's writing. One of the great strengths of East of West was the character design. And I don't really have any idea how heavily involved Hickman is with that, whether he talks to the artists and they work with that framework, or if he basically just lets them follow their muse. If it's the former, he has killer ideas, and if it's the latter, he's choosing his partners incredibly well, because Larraz absolutely kills it with the character design, like Nick Dragotta before him. Whereas I did end up finding R.B. Sylvia's art a little, for lack of a less mean way to say it, Sean Gordon Murphy light. I didn't hate it, it's still very good, but not something that stuck with me, you know? The coloring, however, by Marte Gracia is in both series, and he kills it. I've been trying to learn the names of some more colorists to expand my knowledge base, and Gracia here just made it to the top of my must-memorize list, because he absolutely knows how to make a scene start to ooze with atmosphere, with his incredibly coordinated and impressive colors. If I had to give the whole series an MVP, Gracia would probably be a pretty big contender. Overall, I'm excited to see where this goes, and while I don't think it sold me on superhero comics, as almost everything I like is something that clearly is against the norm in the genre, it has certainly resold me on Hickman and everyone he's working with here. Martyrs, the 2015 remake, directed by Kevin and Michael Gautz. Martyrs is a 2008 French horror film often cited as a part of the new French extremity movement, a movement largely characterized by extreme violence, a transgressive approach to cinema, and being overall nasty as all hell. Martyrs also happens to be one of my 3 favorite movies of all time, a darkly contemplative look at everything from cults, the afterlife, sexism, trauma and PTSD, the limits to how much one person can help another, and depression. It looks at these ideas with an eye for both beauty and cruelty, often blurring the lines between the two and mixing. It's a movie I've seen 6 times and walked away with different things each time, but also a movie I don't recommend very many people watch, as the harshness of how it tells its story, mixed with just how dark and how violent it can be at times, makes recommending it a dangerous game. It's a movie that I wish everyone could watch, but recognize that some people simply cannot. Not everyone is a horror freak like me, but if you have the stomach for some incredible nihilism mixed with extreme violence and pain, then there are few things on this earth I can recommend more. It changed my life, and I love it with all my heart. This, however, is not an essay on that film. No, Instead of me getting to talk about a movie that I genuinely believe is an unparalleled masterpiece, instead of being able to discuss in detail its themes, cinematography, emotional resonance, a specific scene that makes me almost cry every time, the way it balances the two disparate halves that make it up, or any of the myriad of things I could probably go on about for longer than the actual runtime of the film. No. Instead, this essay will be about the 2015 American remake. This can only go well for me. Let it be known that I had never intended to watch this film. The original is perfect as far as I'm concerned, so why bother watch someone do it worse, much less the Americans? As, in my experience, American remakes of foreign films rarely go particularly well. But my girlfriend and I had jokingly thrown around the idea of me getting blind drunk and watching with a specific intention of raging in it. And while performing the ritualistic, endless dance of trying to pick a movie for us two to watch, I noticed that the remake was on Amazon Prime, but would be taken off in the near future. This is our last chance, might as well do it now. So we settled on that and turned it on. I really did try to enter the movie with something resembling an open mind. I think no matter what, I was going to have a bias, but I did do my best. I wish the movie had offered me the same courtesy. The American remake of Martyrs is worthless, and I don't mean that in the generic insult sense. I mean it is without worth. There is no worth to be found in it. Well, that's not fair. There is one gore shot that I did like. So, of its 86-minute runtime, about 15 seconds of it has literally anything to offer. So, doing some quick math and rounding, that means that 0.3% of this movie is not utterly without value. Awesome. I'll give a brief plot summary of the original film so my criticisms will make some sense, but it should be noted that the remake differs from the original in a few ways. So, if you have any intention of watching the movie yourself, whether today, tomorrow, next week, or in 3 years, I personally beg of you, skip the rest of this essay, go on to whatever I'm going to talk about next, and wait. I don't want to impact your viewing of it at all if I can avoid it. I will not be offended if you skip this. Come back and watch this after you've seen the original. However, if you've already seen it or have no intention of doing so, let's begin. Martyrs begins with a young girl named Lucy, held captive by unseen tormentors, who manages to escape from them. She ends up in an orphanage where she meets Anna, another young girl who she quickly forms a bond with. Lucy, despite having escaped the warehouse she was kept in, is still being stalked by a naked woman completely covered in cuts and scars, who moves in this half-limp that honestly still puts shivers up my spine, who is intent on killing her. I will now refer to her as the monster for ease of communication. The monster breaks into the orphanage and almost manages to get to her, before she is rescued. Cut 15 years later, and we see a now grown-up Lucy gun down a family of 4. A father, a mother, a son, and a daughter, in a ruthlessly efficient and brutal manner. She tells Anna that the parents were the people who captured and tortured her all those years ago. After this, Lucy is once again attacked by the monster, who manages to cause severe harm before vanishing when Anna rescues her. Anna and Lucy attempt to clean up the scene of the complete slaughter of the family, but Anna, doubting whether this family were actually the people behind what happened to Lucy, discovers that the mother is still barely clinging to life. She attempts to help the mother escape secretly, but is discovered by Lucy, who bludgeons the mother to death, and screams at Anna, desperately asking why she doesn't believe her when she says that they were the people who did this to her. The monster then appears again. Lucy begs it to leave her alone, telling it that she killed the entire family, that it's over. She even killed their children. The monster, unmoved, continues to attack her, slamming her head into a wall repeatedly. Flashback to Lucy as a child when she was escaping the warehouse. She's just about to walk out when she sees a woman also chained up, begging for help from her. It's the monster. Lucy, unable to do anything, just a child, apologizes and runs away crying. Cut to Anna's perspective. There is no monster. And we, the audience, realize, with a sinking feeling that is even filling me as I write this, that the monster was never real. It's her own broken mind and survivor's guilt. She is being stalked by the woman that she could not save. Anna watches helplessly as Lucy slits her own wrists and kills herself. But to Lucy, it's the monster doing it to her. And then the second half of the movie begins. After passing out from exhaustion and briefly mourning Lucy, Anna discovers a hidden room, a dungeon. Lucy was right. These were the people who did this to her, and they were doing it again. Lucy died correctly believing that no one trusted her. Anna investigates and finds a woman so completely covered in scars that it is clear she has been tortured for years at a time. It's the woman that Lucy left behind. The monster, or at least the real person that the monster was based on. Anna tries to help her, but her mind and body are so completely shattered that nothing can be done. She attempts to bathe her and address the worst of the wounds, and both of them fall asleep. They wake up. The woman formerly known as the monster begins screaming, terrified. And before Anna can help her in any way, the woman is shot by people in suits. And Anna is chained up. Out comes a woman known only as Mademoiselle, and she explains what all this is for. The organization that she leads believes that at the edges of extreme pain and suffering, a few select people, mostly women, are capable of transcending reality and becoming martyrs, and they glimpse the afterlife. They want to do this to women in the hopes that after seeing the afterlife, the tortured women will tell them what happens after all this. We are then treated to incredibly cold and cruel scenes of torture, one after another. Often just being a scene of Anna being hit, fading to black, onto another one. Eventually, Anna breaks completely and stops resisting it all, often talking to Lucy in her head about what is happening. The cult believes that she is ready to be made a martyr, and after skinning her alive, they believe it has been done. Mademoiselle approaches the comatose Anna, and Anna whispers something in her ear. The cult holds a large meeting, and Mademoiselle prepares herself alone. Her assistant begins to talk, and the assistant asks if she truly heard what Anna said. Mademoiselle replies yes, and then asks, "Can you imagine what happens after death?" He contemplates for a second and says no, to which she responds, "Keep doubting," and then immediately shoots herself in the head. Our last shot is of Anna in a catatonic state. The film is over. I know that was a fairly thorough summary, but I really want to take apart a lot of the remake, and you really do need the context for that. So where do we start? I guess we can begin with general stuff. The remake seems to have been directed in the magical land of Opposite World, where everything is done the opposite of how it should be. Part of what made the original Martyrs so effective was the way it presented things. The first half of the movie is incredibly grimy, giving you a real feeling for watching the horrible things happen for seemingly no reason. A young girl is kept captive in an abandoned warehouse, and it feels dirty, dilapidated, and truly horrifying. You see it as she sees it, a terrifying place that represents pain and cruelty. And that griminess follows her, with many shots and locations having a distinct feeling of grit. Whereas in the last half of the film, when another character is systematically and precisely tortured with a specific purpose, things are reversed, and the movie instead presents the surroundings as pristine, clean, washed, more akin to a doctor's office than anything else, reasserting the cold and callous cruelty with which things are being done by the cult, making the whole affair uncomfortable in a completely different way. These people are committing truly horrid acts, but the clean areas and precise camera work makes it feel disturbingly cold, reflecting the calculated cruelty that is taking place. Whereas it is literally the reverse in the remake, where the warehouse feels oddly sterile and is shot more like a mid-tier cop show than a horror movie. And the hidden dungeon feels distinctly more grimy and dank, completely undercutting the whole idea of the cult. The reasoning behind this is incomprehensible, and I can only attribute it to either incompetence or a deliberate and incredibly successful attempt to piss me off. But let's move on. We could talk about the character of Mademoiselle, who in the original is a calm but clearly deeply devoted woman, who explains the whole concept to Anna with the collected zealotry that anyone who has ever been cornered by a Christian out to convert will recognize immediately. The scary part about her is how earnest she is. She believes what she is doing is ultimately for the best, and she truly, truly respects and appreciates any so-called martyrs. She isn't having Anna tortured out of some psychotic cruelty. She's doing it because in her mind, she is bringing out the best of her. making her into something more. Whereas in the remake, Mademoiselle, she's called something different because America, but I refuse to learn what it is. She's Mademoiselle. Is played like a goddamn Bond villain, giving psychotic speeches and drinking cups of tea menacingly. Often seen just generically looking evil, removing any actual fear or intrigue her character has, and replacing her with what feels like a copy of a generic stock character. How about the monster? In the original, the realization that she is the mental manifestation of survivor's guilt and trauma is a truly heart-wrenching moment. Things become recontextualized in horrific ways. The monster moves so strangely because of how the woman has been tortured. Her legs no longer capable of walking normally, something Lucy would have known. Not only does the monster in the remake walk around completely normally, doing the bog standard, you see it in the background of a shot and then it walks off screen, but, and you may want to sit down for this, it isn't a woman Lucy saw, or anything. Not once does the remake even attempt to hit that beat, making the entire existence of the monster entirely superfluous. I would have respected it a hell of a lot more if they had just cut it entirely, instead of keeping it and removing the entire point of it, the thing that made it interesting. This is not to mention how incredibly boring the monster looks in comparison to the original. To continue on my hate-filled attack, let's talk about how dumb this movie thinks that you are. In the original, many things are left to the viewer to put together, such as the killing of the children of the family. Did Lucy kill them because she believed they knew? Did she simply do it because she felt it was the only way not to get caught? Was it pure adrenaline and spur of the moment? You can only watch her and draw your own conclusions. It allows the viewer to question, to think. But worry not about that ambiguity, dear moronic hamburger-eating American viewer. This remake aimed at you will make sure nothing is left to the imagination. With Lucy going on an unprompted rant to Anna about how the kids must have known what was going on. Whew! I thought I was going to have to think for a second.
See? They knew. The children. There's more. There's a girl. Oh my God. They knew what their parents were doing, Anna. They're guilty too.
Another example of this would be how quickly the original establishes the bond between Lucy and Anna. We see them interact at the orphanage, Anna attempts to help Lucy through her trauma, and the movie moves on. You know what you need to know. Whereas the remake has flashback after flashback after flashback inserted at what seems to be completely random points throughout the film of them as children just hanging around and spending time together, adding nothing, telling you nothing new, and just making sure that you've managed to get it through your 4-inch thick concrete skull that these two people bonded in childhood. I could point to more examples, but unlike the movie, I don't think you're a barely literate Neanderthal incapable of understanding the most basic of things. So we can move on to something else that I hate. Such as the minor detail that still somehow managed to get under my skin, that in the original, the people who kidnap Anna are all well-dressed, making them feel even more like a high-level conspiracy cult. It almost has this disturbing government operative vibe that makes the whole thing unsettling. These people that in any other context you'd view as professional or even classy in some cases, are doing those atrocious things. Whereas in the remake, the entirety of the cult is dressed like they're about to attend their neighbor's barbecue. I know that's an infinitesimal detail in the grand scheme of things, but it really did bother me. To keep on the costume and makeup department though, don't think you've escaped my ire, guys, not even for a second. In the original, as the plot moves on, especially in the latter half, Anna and Lucy become more and more disheveled, looking worse and worse, especially with Anna as her torture and trauma leads her to becoming barely recognizable. By the end of the movie, she has transformed from a fairly normal-looking young woman into a husk of herself, bald, scarred, dead-eyed, beaten, bruised, and utterly destroyed. It's a visual reflection of what's happened to her as a person. But God fucking forbid the woman not appear conventionally attractive for 1 microsecond in an American movie. As Anna's clothes remain generally clean, her hair still flowing nicely, if messy in the same incredibly normal way everyone's hair is messy in the morning, and face unbruised. Don't you worry. I know, as an American rewatching a French film, you'd absolutely lose your mind if you saw a woman not being hot for 3 seconds. So this remake has bravely made sure you don't have to deal with such a horrid thing. To move on, what about our new character created whole cloth for the remake? Sam, a young girl that is found in the dungeon, who Anna attempts to save, fails, and then at the end succeeds at rescuing. Now, what does Sam add to this film? That is a fantastic question, and to the best of my knowledge, the answer is, drumroll please, kids being hurt is sad. And that raises the stakes, right? As best I can figure, she may be a proxy for the monster of the original, but A, the monster is in this film and you didn't use her, and B, the monster directly tied into Lucy's trauma and guilt, whereas Sam is just some random girl that the cult has taken. I know that torturing people is bad, movie. You don't need to remind me of that with a random child character. Now, I'm sure there are a dozen more things I hate that I could go on about. The ending has been completely reworked in some brain-dead attempt to lighten up the movie. The darkness was the point. And there is a major change that honestly would require so much talking about, I could probably triple the word count of this essay just with insults I would levy at everyone involved in the change, without even getting to why it's technically bad. But I will try to leave it here. The remake of Martyrs is a prime example of someone recognizing that a thing is good and having absolutely no clue about what makes it good, managing to somehow, in many places, be a borderline shot-for-shot remake while still being incalculably worse in every conceivable way. I should have just rewatched the original. The Crow, written and drawn by James O'Barr. The Crow is a black and white indie comic that seems to be inextricably linked with death and sorrow. It was inspired by the death of the writer's fiancée, a victim of a drunk driving accident. The story itself centers around the death and rebirth of the main character, out for revenge on the people who killed him and, much more importantly, raped and murdered his fiancée. The inspiration by real-life events is quite evident. And, on top of that, when adapted into film in 1994, the star of the film, Brandon Lee, was accidentally killed by an improperly checked firearm. If I were a superstitious man, which I'm not, one could very easily make the case that the whole affair is cursed. A story inspired by death, about death, then led to death. The original comic was written as a response to the incredible tragedy that the writer had gone through. However, James O'Barr has noted on several occasions that it brought him no peace, and he believes that by the end of writing it, he was worse off mentally than where he was when he started. This is interesting to me because I think that itself is a theme that the comic touches on. If we are to quite reasonably look at the writing of this comic as an attempt at fantasy vengeance for what happened to O'Barr's lost love, we see him realize the failings of that idea in the very pages themselves. Throughout the story of The Crow, the actual revenge part of the situation is uncomplicated and, frankly, not all that interesting. The Crow stalks people for a bit, walks into a room, kills them with complete ease. At no point are you scared for his safety, or think the criminals have any chance of escape, because I don't think that's what the story is interested in. Unlike a John Wick or a Taken, the actual process seems to be a relatively uninteresting part of the whole affair. John Wick does have things to say about revenge and its futility, but it is ultimately selling itself on the actual revenge part. If you turn on John Wick, it's probably as an action film first, and a meditation on revenge a fairly distant second. Whereas The Crow is specifically about grief, before revenge I'd say, and how revenge does not abate or help one move past grief. There are scenes throughout the story of the protagonist alone and trying to deal with his grief, cutting his wrists, weeping alone, and just reliving the memories he has with his beloved. And we see it at all points, so much so that once all the chips are down and all the guilty parties securely put in the ground, nothing is gained. The story ends with the Crow taking his own life. Unlife, death, I don't know. Even once the goal of the entire story has been accomplished, fundamentally nothing has changed for the character. He's still miserable, he still misses his love, and with nothing to pursue, he ends up being aimless and committing suicide. And I imagine the situation may have been the same for O'Barr. For a while he tried to address his pain through a fantasy revenge story, but once it was all finished, he realized he was still back at square one. In the foreword, O'Barr noted that he initially blamed himself for the death of his love. He had asked her for a ride, and if he'd only called her 5 minutes later, or walked home, or whatever, she wouldn't have been where she was when she was struck by the driver. And the Crow notes a similar thing. If he had not been in the area with her when they had been attacked, or if he had been able to fight the men off, things would have been different. But that is of course ridiculous, and the Crow is told this by another character. You need to forgive, not the people who did this to you, but yourself. It isn't reasonable to expect yourself to be omniscient. Your survivor's guilt is understandable, but not rational. To move on, I enjoyed the art reasonably well. It does this interesting thing where the style switches semi-regularly, giving the whole affair this dream-like atmosphere that somewhat entranced me. Being an incredibly late 80s, early 90s edgy muscle comic one page, and this beautifully shaded, delicate moment of love the next. It keeps you on your toes in a way that I found interesting. It's interesting that O'Barr notes that he actually wrote and finished this in the early 80s, and it was shelved for a while before it actually came out. Considering how much of an artifact of the late 80s and early 90s the whole thing feels, this slots right alongside the move to edgier comics facilitated by the likes of Watchmen, The Dark Knight Returns, anything Rob Liefeld did, and others. Hell, the art at times reminded me of a more competent version of the insanity that the 90s comic art degenerated into before the Great Crash. The comic is somehow at the same time ahead of its time and yet exactly of its time. Ultimately, I can pontificate about theme and context all day, but the truth of the matter is I was underwhelmed by this. While I do think it has things to say, and I have tried to articulate them, ultimately with this comic I just didn't feel all that affected, and I'm really having trouble articulating why. So many pieces are in place that interest me and are things that I would traditionally like, but I doubt I'll ever end up rereading it. I always feel weird when I see exactly why someone would like something and just get nothing out of it myself, especially if a surface description would lead me to believe that I would love it. But I'm really trying to figure out what it is that just doesn't click for me. I'm coming up blank. Maybe I'll try rewriting this at some point if I ever come up with what it is that I'm missing, but as is, I have this weird feeling of disconnect I can't quite put my finger on. Muppet Treasure Island, directed by Brian Henson. So last month, for the first time, I watched The Muppets. I checked out their first movie and had very little to say about the whole affair, because the first Muppet movie just rules in a very uncontroversial way. It's just great, every part of it. Literally the only thing I didn't like in the whole thing was Miss Piggy and Janice. Otherwise, it was great in a very simple and understandable way. Nothing doesn't work, everything is fun. Why even bother talking about it? So I went into Muppet Treasure Island with high hopes. I like The Muppets now, and despite having not read it since I was quite young, I do also like Treasure Island. Two great tastes, mix them together, and what do you get? An underwhelming movie is what you get, apparently. Now, the whole affair starts strong as hell. The opening song, Shiver My Timbers, is this booming delight of Muppet pirates singing a surprisingly risque song for a, kids movie that references both rum and Satan. So my hype increased even more. Dope pirate song, Muppets, and a book I like? Hell yes. What more could a man possibly want from a movie? And then the first scene starts, and my stomach sank. There's a human, and he's a major character. And by human, I mean a kid. Shit. I don't want people in my Muppets movie, man. I just don't. If I'm turning on the Muppets, I want to see the Muppets. Humans need not apply. The original movie did have humans, but not many, and they're basically all just fun little cameos, all culminating to a legitimately jaw-dropping one at the end that blew me the hell away. But none of them were actually, characters. But right away, I knew this wasn't the route that this was going. This wasn't just a human, this wasn't just a kid, this was a wide-eyed kid with that annoying, soaring voice young boys have. We're in trouble. See, the original Muppet movie knew that you could sell yourself to kids without, having any. Through no fault of their own, basically all children, with very few exceptions, are terrible actors, and as a result, extremely annoying. And the first Muppet movie knew this, so it just allowed the Muppets to rule, and didn't bother trying to include a self-insert character for the more dim-witted amongst the audience. This movie did not learn that lesson, however, and it is all the poorer for it. This may also be too hot of a take for someone who is just coming upon the phenomena of the Muppets now, but I will stand by it. I like when the Muppets are being themselves. I don't want them to do parody versions of other characters. I like calling Kermit Frog, and I like calling Gonzo, and I like calling Animal fucking awesome. He is the best Muppet. This I know to be true. To contribute to my cavalcade of criticisms, I found the movie to be far too structured. The original is a fun little road trip movie and plays everything loose and fast, just Muppets wandering from location to location and generally from joke to joke. There is a running through line, but it's deliberately thin and just a way to connect the dots of fun. Whereas this has a capital P plot with acts and everything. I don't know. I just really enjoyed the more Muppets having fun with each other vibe than I did a more structured story about a kid going on a pirate adventure. Now, to be fair, it isn't a total bust. The Muppets, even with their diminished screen time, do manage to still be a delight, and funny as all hell. There's a running joke with a bunch of rats stowing away on the ship and treating it like a pleasure cruise that comes back the exact correct amount of times, never overstaying its welcome and becoming repetitive, and always managing to get a smile from me. Animal continues to rule with his one line where he just excitedly yells,
Never get involved in politics.
Politics! Politics!
because Animal knows the value of staying politically engaged. Also, this is a point that can't really be held against the movie, but still kind of burrowed under my head. It was really weird for me watching a pirate-themed movie without the Pirates of the Caribbean soundtrack. That soundtrack is so embedded in my head as what you hear when pirates are on screen that even if it's an entirely different property, I still expect to hear it. Also, I should rewatch the original Pirates trilogy at some point during this challenge, because I have a lot to say about those movies. I digress. Muppet Treasure Island isn't just straight bad or anything, it just didn't live up to the hype that the first movie gave me. In hindsight, I should have seen it coming in the opening credits though, because in there is something that would have foretold all the homogenization and mediocrity that was to come. In there was a symbol of all mediocrity and homogenization. If those two things were a nation, this would be its official flag. The Disney Corporation. Yep. It's all beginning to make sense. Of course they shoved a useless self-insert kid character in. Of course they just tried to weld a random plot onto the Muppets. And, of course, the whole affair feels soulless. That's their whole thing. Even if I go back to the 90s, Disney is still out trying to suck all the inequity out of everything. I'm sticking this point at the very end because I'm hoping my girlfriend will have tuned out by now, and I won't have the tar beat out of me for saying it, but I didn't like Tim Curry in this movie very much at all. And I'm starting to think I don't really like Tim Curry in general. He always feels like he's mugging to the camera and trying to be a ham master, but it always feels forced and contrived. I don't get why people love him so much. Baraka, directed by Ron Frick. Baraka is a 1992 narrative-free film that is primarily footage of the world around us, both natural and man-made, capturing small and great moments alike and presenting them without comment. I watched this movie on the recommendation from a good friend of mine, and in hindsight it makes sense that this would be something that she would recommend to me, as primarily I think it's about connectivity. I think of a shot of several Orthodox Jews praying at the Western Wall, going through their routines, and the cut from that will often be to another group of people performing their own rituals of worship. While things are obviously different, garb, routine, duration, etc., these rituals we go through on a day-to-day basis are uniting in and of themselves. The act of worship is in itself something that we share, whether it be to Yahweh, Jesus, Muhammad, ourselves, or even more abstract concepts like self-improvement. What is the great fundamental difference between starting your day with a prayer to your deity of choice and starting it by saying your self-affirmations in a mirror? This movie seems to be positing, through its rotation of images, there isn't one. Not really. The shots on display are always gorgeous. I had the same thought while watching it that I do while watching the David Attenborough narrated documentaries like Earth or Blue Planet. How on earth did they get these shots? How long did it take to get them? So many of them are these breathtaking moments that are both so fleeting and yet so impactful. The comparison to Attenborough's work, however, did bring with it a complaint that I have. That for many of you may be irrelevant or even silly sounding, but did impact me particularly. Part of what I like so much about those documentaries is the narration. Hopefully not because I'm a low attention span moron, but more because when presented with these beautiful moments, I immediately want to know more. There was a particular scene involving a bunch of what I presume to be South American tribesmen performing a collective dance? I'll say dance. And I immediately wanted to know who they were, where they were, what the dance signified, and what was significant about it in their culture, and how I could find out those questions and more. But Baraka isn't particularly interested in that, Everything is presented only as what it is, moments in our world. The details are less important than their very existence. And while I admire that goal, I know I'd have liked to have fallen down several dozen Wikipedia rabbit holes after watching this movie. There was also one particular sequence that I found to be a bit on the pretentious side. A little over halfway through the movie, we start a sequence of contrasting the bustle of modern day life. You see people loading in and out of trains, walking along the sidewalk, clearly off somewhere, people in business attire, clearly going either to or from work, and then this is contrasted with thousands of baby chicks being put through the assembly line at a factory farm. Listen, I'm an anti-capitalist. I already agree that the modern day structure is inherently exploitative and unfulfilling. But this sequence struck me as very film school sophomore, that is if the shots weren't still so intensely well put together. However, these are both minor complaints when looking at the totality of the piece. I was really interested in how the film conveyed ideas without narrative or any real structure, just using the basics of editing and contrast to show you what it wanted to say. Among other things, this movie seemed to be really interested in finding out just how much explicit meaning one can put across in film without saying anything or conforming to a narrative structure. It almost exists more as a moving painting or a photo gallery than it does a film. I guess that's what experimental cinema is really for, finding out just how much you can do in these weird and interesting ways. I think it holds value just in creating interest, showing these moments of the world and reminding you just how vast Earth and its people can be. It can be really easy to find your routine and go through it with little to no looking outward. This is my route to work, these are the people that I see there, this is my community, this is my home, and so on and so on. Something like Baraka exists to remind you that even if you live in the most diverse city in the world, which according to my quick Google search is Toronto, go Canada, you will always only be seeing the most minute of details on a planet much bigger than any of us. That this planet contains rituals, cultures, people, landscapes, and so many other things that no single person could ever hope to experience the totality of. I'm glad I watched this for the reminder of my own insignificance and the ability to see those moments captured so beautifully. This isn't the type of movie I could make my entire consumption out of. As beautiful and as interesting as it was, I might be too much of a brainlet to watch something like this all the time. I did find myself glancing at my phone on occasion, just because my mind would eventually begin to wander, looking at the footage. Something I'm not particularly proud of admitting, but I think it's important to see things like this. In the same way leaving your hometown can be important. It's good to be reminded of our place in the world and the vastness of everything outside our norm, both in the small-scale sense of watching a movie that wouldn't traditionally cross your radar, and in the larger scale that I've been talking about, in realizing the importance of the world that we don't always see, or even interact with in any way.